this is the internals of a transmission on a Reaper. I can turn the camera. See, this is your built-in bell housing, your throwout bearing, mounted right in there, your clutch actuator, or your bearing actuator that actuates your clutch. This is the inside of the housing. This side and the bearing that would be in this side of the housing would be to your rear, would be your rear output. The bearing that I had in question this time that you can see, there's considerable amount of play in that, and you can feel it, is my front output bearing, which I've already had my rear output bearing go pretty much in that same manner. You can see there is a bearing race that fits for main drive gear, that goes in there, that fits in there. That is a tapered bearing. I've gone through and cleaned everything out, cleaned the housing up pretty much best I can. When you take a transmission apart, I'll also show this when it's all together. You have 2 ball bearings and 2 springs and nuts that keep the tension on there. Those are for your indents for your shift mechanism. You also have your top cap, which this goes in to actuate for the reverse gear. So when you put it in reverse, I'll show you where those gears are. You also have your main drive gear. This is the output bearing, still mounted on that drive gear. Also, you have speedometer gear that's mounted behind that. This is a plastic gear. One modification I did in earlier times for this bearing is, you can see the speedometer gear fits very tightly to this bearing. What I've done is I've gone around and drilled holes in the speedometer gear, because as that sits inside this housing, speedometer gear would go in here, and your speedometer sensor would come through that hole and is driven off the gear. You can see the way that bearing fits in and the way this lip is. That speedometer gear fits very closely to the edge of the mounting point for the bearing, and my idea was to drill holes in the speedometer gear to allow oil to drain around past that more. Also, what I did in modification on this, and earlier when I had my other bearing go, is that this is a fling type system, and it's throwing oil around through the whole system all the time. But what you have is, when this is mounted in the machine, which would be this way, your big main drive gear is throwing that oil around, and the way that bearing was. What I did is your main drive gear comes really close to this support radius that's molded into the aluminum. I drilled holes in each one of these little pockets to, as if it's holding any oil when that's bolted together behind that gear, that it's going to let oil drip down on the back side of that gear a little bit more and get oil to that bearing bed. Now, my transmission originally failed with roughly 1,000 miles or going on 2,000 miles when I first had my output bearing for the rear go out, and I've replaced that with a new bearing, obviously. The thing you can see is the bearings on these. The thing to remember is this is, I don't even know if this has a manufacturer's name on it, but you know, they're pretty much identical bearings, and very good possibility they're even made in the same plant. But by going to a better name bearing when you replace these, such as National, SKS, or other big bearing manufacturers, you have to remember that a bearing can be made right beside another bearing. But those bigger name companies have better standards, better quality standards, and higher tolerances for the way the bearings are made. ultimately what I've seen happen on this, and I've done a lot of different mechanic work, and I've never seen bearings fail quite this way. I'm under the assumption that the hardness of these races does not meet the quality or the same hardness as the races as the bearing that it's replacing. It appears that what's happened with these bearings is, whether it's by shim or whatever the ultimate cause of the bearing failure is, and the way they've worn, is that the temper of the races I don't think goes as deep as a higher brand name quality bearing. It almost appears that once you've worn it so far and it's worn through the temper of the race, it's getting into the softer metal, and then that just starts wearing and ultimately gives you that kind of play. This is my plug. This is what made me, well, I mean, I had my oil seal fail. That's what caused the original issue to look at, see what was going on in my transmission. But you can see that that is my oil plug, and that's where it caught most of all the shavings that came out of my bearing. That's pretty much everything that's worn out of there. The rest of the housing was actually really quite clean. This back around and we'll get back to the main housing. So everything in here is pretty good. I inspected everything, cleaned it all up, flushed the whole housing out, took plate off, looked for any sediment of metal shavings that were in this area behind the bearings. Cleaned out the bearings, cleaned out the main bearing on the big drive gear. Got my replacement bearing, have my replacement seals. I'm going to start putting this back together now, but one other thing I want to show, and this is the point of that I've had a problem with, excuse me, with my shifter binding. I went through my shifter and everything, and some of it was within the shifter, dirt, and the mounting points or the support arms that hold some of the shifting mechanism was a little bent out of shape also. One thing I've noticed when I was doing it at that time is that this is your shift arm that mounts to the top, like so. Mounts to the top of the transmission, and this is your indent arm that goes up and down and also back and forth to pick your gears. Up and down selects between first and second, third, fourth, then ultimately down into fifth and reverse. On top of this, there is this housing with a seal. It also comes with a rubber boot, and this mounts on top of it, and you can actually see this from the very top of inside the machine. What I've found is that this arm that selects between your gears first to second, or would be your back and forth movement in your shifter H pattern. The problem was, or what I've found, is that when I had all these metal shavings floating around for my bearing failure, so this is kind of a heads up on when you know a bearing failure might be on its way, or some kind of failure within the transmission, is I'll try to show this. You can see they're hard to see. There's a cup to this, and this is polished for that shaft to go through the aluminum housing. But there's an indent within this area. And what I've found out is that indent area is for this spring assembly to sit in, or sit on, I should say. What I found is that all these metal shavings accumulated within that cup area. For the most part, when this is running and the bearing fails, the plug does a really good job of pulling those metal shavings out as it slowly, but with your oil system, the way that throws and that cup design, what I found out was that this lower part of the shaft was scored, as well was the surface that slides through. And that was causing my binding because it had gotten a collection of metal shavings in there, and this was moving very, very tightly. I just wasn't able to get, it really took a lot of effort to move that. So after I've taken the transmission apart and cleaned everything out, what I did is I took some 2000 grit wet dry sandpaper, roll up in tube, put it in there, and sanded that area with that bushing, and also took the shaft and sanded that shaft with 2000 grit sandpaper also to polish it back out. Now I can see that that's moving. Now I can just move it up and down by hand like it's supposed to when there's a little oil applied, and it's going to be much better operation. And that's part of your binding. If you get into a binding, that's going to be within your H pattern. If it starts going back and forth in your H pattern, because that's when this is going to be actuated up and down. And actually it should be spring loaded and should come back up to neutral, and then you pull it up and then go down to neutral and it's spring loaded back down. When this cover's in place, actually makes it spring loaded when it pulls up, and then that pushes it back to neutral also, and that's what finds your neutral position. That is the biggest finding I found with, so if you are having binding in your shifter, going to fifth or reverse, probably most likely fifth or reverse, and you've cleaned your shifter and you know your shift cables are in good shape and all your mechanisms are good there, then I'd be definitely pulling the plug on the transmission and looking for any metal shavings in there. And this can be pulled out, this whole assembly can be pulled out with the transmission still mounted inside to inspect it and clean that shaft. It's going to be kind of hard to clean that cup area with this thing mounted inside there. But as far as it being mounted inside there, what you have is you have a small bolt with a little shoulder that fits in the H pattern within this system here, which allows the movements to go through the gear. This acts as a retainer, screws into the side and locks into place. And then there's also, as this is all put together, there's also another bolt on this, if you can see, that has a shaft in it, and that just rides above this and allows this whole assembly from being able to come out. I guess I would say in case this fails, it stops the whole shaft from coming out of there. So that's what I found as far as the shifter binding. Now I'm going to start putting everything back together, and once I get the bearings in, my gears in, I'll fire up the camera again and show you how to put the housing together, and then you can see how to take the housing apart, because you'll just be doing it in reverse from the way I'm putting